Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And welcome to the second half of Lecture 24, Slavery and Manifest Destiny. Now before we begin, hit pause on your screen and jot down the lecture outline, starting with the Compromise of 1850 down there, as well as take particular attention to those key terms at the top. Now with that, let's begin. Now, we left off, we just had a war with Mexico, the Mexican-American War. And one of the big outcomes, besides the issue of the 75 to 100,000 Mexicans, what to do with them, was the issue we now have another 530,000 square miles. We have to decide, what do we want to do with it? And more specifically, should this new territory be slave or free? This becomes the dominant issue in the 1850s. Now, what was clear, though, was Texas would enter as a slave state. They always had been slave, therefore it made sense. But what about the other states? Now, Southerners proposed that slavery be extended to all the territory. On the one hand, this makes some sense. Why not just apply the Missouri Compromise line? Extend the 3630 line all the way across the southern part of the United States, and there you have it. Texas, Oklahoma, pretty much all of New Mexico and Arizona, and, well, Southern California will become a southern slaveholding state. But then again, when have we ever applied existing compromises, Northwest Ordinance, Missouri Compromise, to any future actual activity, despite the fact that was their function? And so, rather than use the Missouri Compromise, instead there was a new proposal, and it was proposed by the man right here, the little giant himself, Jack Black. Stephen Douglas. Now try to unsee that one. You will always think Jack Black now. Now, Stephen Douglas, he's a senator from Illinois. He says, screw the 3630 line Missouri Compromise. No. Popular sovereignty is where it's at. So what is popular sovereignty? Well, let the territories themselves decide whether they want slavery or not. In other words, let the people who actually live there vote and decide whether they want to be a slave state or slave territory or a free state or territory. And of course, this appeals to an American democratic ideal. What could be better than self-government? Yeah, true American way. It seemed like a great idea. And it worked for about a year. Didn't last long. Because by 1849, things start falling apart again. By the time we get to 1850, things are really in shambles. And the issue here was California. And basically by 1850, both the North and the South were convinced that the other side was out to get them. And both sides had a couple major issues they were dealing with. Now, the first problem was California wanted to enter as a free state. This would upset the senatorial balance once again. And so that would upset Southerners. Southerners were also upset over the lax enforcement, in their opinion, of the Fugitive Slave Act. They accused the North of basically ignoring the Fugitive Slave Act and not returning their slaves, which they probably were. The North, however, was also upset in 1850 because they had some tremendous fears. The first fear, first and foremost, was, see that New Mexico and Utah territory? It's undecided. Supposedly popular sovereignty will govern it, whether or not be slave or free. Well, okay, it's only 2 territories, no big deal. But what if those were not just 2 big territories, but rather 5, 6 smaller slave states that would forever skew the senatorial balance in favor of slave power? This was a big issue for Northerners, the what-if scenario. Oh, and they were still upset that there was a slave trade in Washington, D.C. And also slavery as well. So slavery and slave trade. And so we have a major problem in 1850. So when you're in trouble, who do you call? Henry Clay. Yep, he's getting pretty old. He's still around 1850. He's been now in politics since 1810, so 40 years He's been there. Poor Henry Clay can never get a win. Known as the Great Compromiser at 73 years young, in 1850, the author of the Great Missouri Compromise of 1820 is once again, he has a plan to solve all of America's problems and re-put our country back together. He proposes an omnibus bill that will solve everyone's problems. The problem is, when Congress voted on a single omnibus bill, it went down in abject defeat. Henry Clay boarded a train to go back home to Kentucky, and before he got there, he died on the train. Did he moment of silence for Henry Clay? Poor Henry Clay. Did so many great things, but he couldn't solve the compromise in 1850. Dies on the way back home on a train. Don't worry, though. Stephen Douglas is there to pick up the torch. And Stephen Douglas takes Henry Clay's omnibus bill, breaks it into 4 smaller parts. And guess what? Each one of them, as a smaller piece of legislation, passes through Congress. Yeah, poor Henry Clay just can't get a win ever. Even in death, he couldn't pass his bill. But Stephen Douglas did, as smaller pieces of legislation. And of course, as historians now, we kind of put them all back together as one big lump sum, and we collectively call it the Compromise of 1850, which technically speaking, its author now is Stephen Douglas. So what does the actual compromise entail? Well, California will be a free state, which will end senatorial balance, free versus slave. On the other hand, the territorial governments of New Mexico and Utah will decide slavery based on popular sovereignty. So a win for the North, a win for the South. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, will be abolished in Washington, D.C. So a partial win for the North. And then number 4, the issue over the Fugitive Slave Act. This becomes the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850. And that's because what was set up to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act was a new judge system. So here's what happened. If an African American was accused of being a runaway, the white person would take the black man before a judge, or the black person before a judge, and the judge would decide, not a jury, a judge would decide whether or not he was indeed a runaway or he was a free person. Well, here's the kicker, though. If the judge ruled that the accused runaway was indeed a free person, the judge would receive $5. If they determined that the accused runaway was indeed a runaway slave, they received $10 for their troubles. So can we say corruption? They can be bought. And this commissioner judge, again, they're being denied a right to trial by jury, which is constitutional law. This commission judge system was easily bribed then so you could accuse any African American of being a runaway slave, get a corrupt judge, and force anyone into the institution of slavery. Again, this is considered a huge betrayal of civil rights, civil liberties, and of course, royally pisses off the North. And then things get worse. And it gets worse in large part thanks to, well, the man on your right, Stephen Douglas. You see, Stephen Douglas, in 1854, he wants to make a name for himself because he pats himself on the back after the Compromise of 1850, says, good job, Stephen Douglas. And he wants to make a national name for himself because he has aspirations to become president, and he needs a national issue that will curry favor in both the North and South. And to do so, he proposes a transcontinental railroad that will run from his home state of Illinois out to California. And you kind of see the railroad line on your screen. Now, this is a genius move by Stephen Douglas in many ways. This is a national issue of manifest destiny. Spread our culture, our technology, our people from sea to shining sea. It is expansion. It is everything that as Americans we held dear. And as a senator from Illinois, it greatly benefits his home state because, well, it's going to go through Illinois. The problem comes in this big area in the middle of the map you can see there that's called unorganized territory. And the problem is, if you have a federal project going through these areas, you need to organize it. You need to make it into an organized territory with a territorial government to administer law and order and upkeep on the railroad lines. So fine, no big deal. Let's organize it. And so, in 1854, Stephen Douglas proposes what's called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Fantastic. Let's just divide that unorganized territory into two smaller territories, one called Nebraska, one called Kansas. Fantastic. The question, though, is the age-old question. What do you do with these territories? Do you, A, employ the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which makes sense, given these were territories prior to the Missouri Compromise? But if you do that, both these territories are above the 3630 line, which makes them free. This, if you remember correctly, according to the Missouri Compromise, Southerners acquiesced because they said there's no need for slavery there. It's bad land for growing. But in the 1850s political climate, this was no longer a viable thought process. And so many proposed, including Stephen Douglas, open it up to popular sovereignty. And so if you want Southerners to agree to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you have to open it up to popular sovereignty, and Stephen Douglas does. And so initially, Southerners rejected this proposal, but only accepted after Stephen Douglas says, hey, sure, why not? This is the beginning of the end of the two-party system in America. This two-party system that allowed compromises to continue working. Because as long as the two-party system existed, as long as you could be a Democrat in Michigan or Alabama, or a Whig in Wisconsin or South Carolina, you voted based on political ideology, not on regional ideology. In the Kansas-Nebraska Act debates, when the final votes are cast that pass the act, Southern Whigs voted not as Whigs, they voted as Southerners. So did Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats and Southern Whigs greatly supported this bill, not because it was big versus small government, but because it opened slavery up to these new territories under popular sovereignty. Similarly, Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats voted together as Northerners, not as political parties, because they opposed the act because it opened up slavery in the Northern territories. So Southerners voted as Southerns, despite their big versus small government ideology of Whigs versus Democrats. And Northerners voted as Northerners, not as Whigs or as Democrats. This bill was seen by Northerners to destroy a criminal betrayal of their precious rights of compromise. The passage and debates over the Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed not only the Whig Party, but the two-party system in America. Now, don't worry, there will be a new party to replace the Whig Party, and that, of course, is the Republican Party. But the party stood for many of the same economic issues as the Whig Party did. It did believe in a more active government, but it had a position on slavery, unlike the Whig Party. Now, most Republicans, including its soon-to-be leader Abraham Lincoln, did believe that slavery should not be extended. The most common party platform for Republicans, for most mainstream Republicans, starting after 1854, was that slavery can exist where it already does. However, Republicans did not want to see it expand. So what we find after 1854, though, is yes, there will be a new political party, the Republican Party, which, yes, that is the current Republican Party in name, even though their ideologies had changed over time. Because in 1854, the Democratic Party believed in small government, the Republican Party believed in big government. They kind of flip-flopped. If you take 1302, you will understand when this happens and how this happens. But the Republican ideology was slavery can exist, they just want to extend into new territories. Whereas the Democrat Party believed that slavery should be extended wherever they want. But the difference is this, even though there are still two political parties, this is not considered the two-party American system, the second American party system, because Republicans were in the North, Democrats were in the South, and they were voting based on regional ideologies, not on necessarily political ideologies. And this is only the beginning of troubles in 1854, 1855, 1856. Things only continue to disintegrate. And it really begins to disintegrate even more over competition for Kansas. Because no sooner had the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed than the question now becomes, hey, wait, popular sovereignty is the rule of the day? Fantastic. So here's what we're going to do, people. Let's talk about how do we get popular sovereignty to work for us? And the way you do that, of course, is to, remember, popular sovereignty, the people who live there get to vote on whether they want slavery or not. So no sooner is the bill passed through Congress than Massachusetts begins sending hundreds of settlers out west to go settle the Kansas Territory for the explicit purpose of voting to make it a free territory. And so they begin settling in Kansas along Pottawatomie Creek. You see on the map there. There we go. There's Pottawatomie Creek. Missouri, however, which is right across the border, they also respond to the need of settling Kansas to make it pro-slave, though. In fact, David Atchison, he's a Democratic senator from Missouri, he believed that slaveholders in Missouri had a duty to make Kansas a slave territory. In 1853, he pledged to, quote, extend the institutions of Missouri over the territory in Kansas at whatever sacrifice of blood or treasure, unquote. In fact, he recommended that every Missourian, if need be, to, quote, kill every gosh darn, not his words, abolitionist in the district, unquote. He accused New England of being immoral, uncivilized, and hypocritical for sending these anti-slavery abolitionists into Kansas for hope of swaying the election and undermining the democratic process. So what has happened? Well, 1854, there's an election held to determine whether or not Kansas Territory will be free or slave, and on election night, 2 times as many people who lived in Kansas cast votes. In fact, the reason for this was hundreds, if not thousands, of Missourians crossed the border and cast votes to make Kansas a slave territory. This despite the fact that most people who actually lived in Kansas were known as free soilers. They opposed any blacks, free or slave, from being there. They wanted a white-only territory. So the people who lived there wanted white only. They're known as free soilers. No blacks, period. Then there was the group from Massachusetts who came to vote against slavery. There's abolitionists. Then you have the Missourians who crossed the border and illegally voted. They weren't even settlers or residents there. They just voted illegally to sway the election in favor of slavery. And it works. Slavery becomes the law of the land in Kansas, thanks to this illegal voting from Missouri. Now, the problem then comes the following year, March of 1855. There was a second election held. Now, we've already settled the issue of slavery, but now we need to elect a territorial legislation, a territorial government. And in this election, the question becomes, do you want to elect pro-slavery legislature or a abolitionist or anti-slavery legislature, or a free soiler one for that matter? And of course, in March of 1855, the same pattern of illegal voting, border crossing from Missouri occurred once again. And Atchison himself, senator from Missouri, drinking considerable whiskey, will lead a small band of armed Missourians across the border to vote and frighten away would-be free soil voters. Not surprisingly, the election results showed that the territory elected a pro-slavery legislation. Free soilers, by the way, they will decide to hold their own convention. They are outraged by now twice having their will usurped. They will form a free soil government that will ban blacks from the state, and they will set up a capital in Lawrence, Kansas. Whereas the pro-slavery legislation that was elected back in March is going to set up a government in Lecompton. So by summer of 1855, there are now two governments in Kansas. One at Lawrence, which is a free soil opposed to any blacks whatsoever in the territory, and a pro-slavery delegation at Lecompton. You remember how David Atchison once said that whatever blood or treasure we should impose, slavery in the state? Well, his words were almost prophetic because blood will flow. And in fact, we term this Bleeding Kansas. A year later, in May of 1856, blood will flow in Kansas. Because in 1856, May of 1856, supported by a pro-Southern, pro-slave, federal marshal, a mob is going to enter into Lawrence, the capital of the free soil government. They will vandalize, burn, and destroy anything with a free soil label. This included, presses, newspaper presses, hotels, homes, shops, etc. This was mob violence at its worst, just because they didn't want slavery or African Americans at all. So this was May of 1856. 3 nights later after this attack in Lawrence, Kansas, the man pictured on your right, John Brown, believing he was doing God's will lead a small band of men, including 4 of his own sons, to a pro-slavery settlement at Pottawatomie Creek. You see on the map there. While they're there, they will get all medieval up in here, and they will hack 5 men to death with broadswords. Again, this is righteous indignation by John Brown. So in May, we have this attack on Lawrence that will break anything with free soil label. 3 days later, John Brown leads a retaliation attack and will hack 5 pro-slavery men to death with broadswords, again, killing them slowly. This event would trigger a mini civil war in Kansas. Over the course of the summer of 56, between May and September, more than 200 people will die until order is finally restored in September of 1856. Now, needless to say, things are out of control in Kansas. But things were also out of control in our nation's capital. The same week as those attacks in Kansas in May of 56, there was an abolitionist by the name of Charles Sumner. He was a Republican congressman out of Massachusetts. He delivers a fiery tirade on the Senate floor known as the, quote, crime against Kansas, unquote. He lashed out against the, quote, incredible atrocities of assassins and thugs, unquote, from the South. He specifically named some names, including David Atchison, senator from Missouri, and Andrew Butler of South Carolina, both very outspoken pro-slavery congressmen. So Charles Sumner gets up, he gives a speech. He specifically calls out 2 senators. 2 days later, Andrew Butler's nephew, remember Andrew Butler was one of the ones that Sumner called out, enters into the Congress building. His name is Preston Brooks. He's also a congressman. He enters into the Capitol building and proceeds to beat Charles Sumner senseless with a cane as he was seated at his Senate desk. And you thought C-SPAN was boring. You have 2 senators, 2 rich old white dudes, arguing over the issues of slavery to the point where one, to defend his uncle's honor, Preston Brooks, enters the Senate chamber and beats Charles Sumner senseless with a cane. And you can see the cartoon here. The men behind him are laughing and cheering it on. It was anything but civil. And so, even before these 2 incidences, even before Bleeding Kansas and this Charles Sumner beating, the New York Tribune newspaper warned, quote, "We are 2 peoples. We are a people for freedom and a people for slavery. Between the 2, conflict is inevitable," unquote. And as the rhetoric and violence in both Kansas and Washington, D.C. demonstrated, the United States had 2 competing visions, 2 separate cultures, and each had a different future destiny of the United States envisioned. In other words, each had a different vision of what made America great. And these, despite so many similarities, right? I mean, the reality is there was a lot more similarities than differences in the United States in the 1850s. But the issue of slavery only widens and grows that chasm of divide between the North and South. As we proceed through the 1850s, things are only going to get wider. But we'll discuss that in our next lecture. So for now, take care. See you next time. Bye-bye.